All right, so you can see everything up on the slides anyway because we missed the start of the recording. We aim for a closed formula to the Cavalier numbers and get the recurrence relation for them sort of along the way. So we only do about 2/3 of the first lecture on Cavalier numbers, then rest of the first week and the second week on sets. There's only a week on functions, about 3 weeks on counting, 1 week each on each of the next 4 topics, and then finally the last 2 weeks on graph theory. So it moves at quite a high pace. And what then happens with such a broad range of topics is that students will pick and choose what they think they're good at. They'll work more at that, and often ignore some of the harder topics. Accounting is the best example of that. Because often when we're marking final exams, for example, we have, with that number of students, we have 3 markers. I'll end up being the one marking accounting questions, and they're the worst attempted questions out of all of the ones in this subject, right? So ignoring the harder questions will lead to a problem, right? And this is, as I said before, the fact that we have overall the whole university about 70% of our students no maths or the lowest level of HSC maths, right, means that they come into our math subjects, and discrete certainly does suffer from this problem, with an insufficient maths background. But the problem's actually worse than that. I'm sure we all know we've had this problem that they actively dislike mathematics, a lot of them. And I wonder why they're choosing any subject. We have the same problem with our engineering students that needs mathematics. They have maths anxiety, they have maths phobia, and so forth, right? So they're trying to just get through the subject with the minimum amount of work. That leads to a high level of disengagement. And one symptom, for example, is the attendance at the Zoom lectures, which stabilizes by the end of the subject to around 10 to 15%. Might start a bit higher, maybe 20, 25%. When week 1, they want to know what the subject is about, what they're going to be doing. And as I said, first semester last year, we got around 400 students. That number of attendees dropped out very quickly to normally somewhere between 40 and 60 students. Now, the tutorial attendance was better. It was around 70%, 75%, because there were assessments in tutorials in most weeks. And I'll get to talking about that in a few minutes. So that shows that many students have little subject content except just to pass. It's just something to get through. And such students generally will fail to achieve the subject learning outcomes, right? So the question that stopped me thinking is, how do you engage such students who will frequently never turn up to classes unless they absolutely have to? We don't have, or we didn't have previous incarnations of subject compulsory attendance for anything, not the tutorials and not the Zoom lectures. But the tutorials with those assessments, as I said, didn't have as much of an attendance problem. However, I would be running some of those tutorials and find that my students knew nothing because they hadn't attended the Zoom lectures. They haven't read. We have a sort of a textbook. It's recommended reading now. They don't look at that. And literally, I'd have to start the tutorials with a 5-minute summary of this is what you're meant to know. And we're going to use this to attempt the questions that we're going through. So I got to thinking about, well, what can I do to improve the student engagement? Yes.
So they don't have interest.
Sorry, no. So that's the point I should have made. That in fact, after COVID, we went to Zoom lectures for almost all of our mathematics subjects, and we're still at that point at Western Sydney. The only exception is the engineering math subjects that still have face-to-face lectures.
Combinatorics?
Sorry, combinatorics as well. Okay, which is a
linear algebra doesn't.
Newer subject. I don't know about linear algebra. I'm not sure about that, but most of our
Zoom is the only choice that happens. It's not like it's a Zoom lecture that happens in person that could come to in person.
No, it's the only choice for, or certainly for this subject, right?
Is it recorded?
It's all
Face-
Zoom lectures.
Face-to-face, though, doesn't work. The attendance is similar for face-to-face
Yeah,
because the university records it, so they all think they're going to watch it later, and they don't.
Yeah, so we'll get to that point. Anyway, I had, when I actually started, and I got my job as part of a decapitalisation type of program, and they made us do a foundations unit for learning and teaching, even though I'd been working as a sessional for 15 years already. And there were projects that we had to do as part of that. So one that I thought of doing, and this is in the days, we're talking decades ago now, where everything was still face-to-face, still had the same problem with lecture attendance. So for a much smaller subject, right, it would have maybe across a couple of different campuses, maybe 70 or 80 students. I decided to introduce lecture quizzes, but with the difference that I would provide the solutions, obviously after they've taken the quizzes, but the students, design the marking scheme. And I wanted them to do that, to get them thinking about the process, to get them thinking about each step in the problem. They were small quizzes, maybe 10 marks, 2 questions worth 5 marks each, right? So there'd be at least 5 steps, probably more, with half marks, and I wanted the students, and they could consult a little bit after they've done the quiz and think about it as I'm going through the solutions. I did that deliberately, that I would do it after they attempted it, and afterwards thought maybe to be better to have a sample. I did have a sample quiz up there and get them to think about it beforehand, and then have the actual quiz similar. Because of course what happened is that they would then tailor their marking schemes to what they knew they'd already written. But anyway, I thought, well, hang on, can I do this with a subject that's this large with Zoom lectures and solve the problem? And I came up with this proposed solution. And I say proposed, but it's actually now been approved at SAC, School Assessment Committee level. So the first incarnation of this will happen this coming semester. And that was the assessment. I found generally that's the one universal motivator. If we agree that students just want to get through the subject, right, then no matter how small the value of the assessment, it can be as little as 1%. Most students will turn up, right, to the classes, even the Zoom lectures, if there are assessments in there, because they feel that every little bit counts and will help them to pass. And the proof is that in the current incarnation of the subject, it's actually not the current, previous incarnation, we have an assessment in 10 out of 12 tutorials. We had, they attended a 1-hour tutorial each week, except for week 1, and an intercession break. So that makes, we had 14-week semesters, so that makes 12 tutorials. And those assessments, we would usually count the best 5 out of 8 quizzes in the past, and they'd be worth 2% each. Right, so it's only worth 10% over the whole subject, and yet you would still get at least 75% attendance in tutorials because of those quizzes, right? So 8 5-minute quizzes at the start of the tutorial, and then 2 45-minute class tests in week 6 and 12, so 10 out of the 12 tutorials with assessment. And without compulsory tutorial attendance, you get the 70 to 80% of students going up. So you didn't have an attendance problem in tutorials. And I thought, okay, the lack of Zoom lecture attendance is a major problem. It's not, by the way, the subject content, despite the fact that there's a lot of topics in there covered in a relatively short period of time. We still have good students. In the autumn, first semester last year, for example, I got 13 HD students and 35 distinction students, right? Over 12% of the final enrollment numbers could get a distinction, so over 75%, or 13 got high distinction, over 85% in that subject. So if they engaged, they could perform well at these topics. And of course, I got good feedback from such students. So I thought, well, I just need more of them to be forced to attend. And I do think that part of the problem, I believe anyway, is that all the lectures, all these Zoom lectures are recorded, right? We are very strongly encouraged to do that. I could probably push back and say, look, I think this is a bad thing. But I understand that there's a need to be flexible and provide this option. If there are genuine clashes with other classes, for example, a lot of our students have to work and so forth. So I live with that. Oops. Yeah, I've done something wrong. Okay. It's assumed that students will watch and listen to those Zoom lecture recordings later on. But of course, in practice, they don't. Right? I think one of the other speakers was talking about, they'll do most of their work between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. or something like that, which they can do with an AI, right? But with a 3-hour Zoom lecture, they're tired at the end of the day. They're just going to be, I'll look at it later, right? And of course, later never comes. They never end up looking at it. So maybe 10% of my students actually watch these Zoom lectures, and some of them might be the students who've attended it as well. So knowing this fact led me to the idea, the first part of a 3-part solution. Okay, I've had the 5-minute quizzes moved to the Zoom lecture. Right? They're going to be password protected, so that you can't get it takes time, short 5-minute quiz to start telling your friend who's with their genius friend or whatever, who's remotely, what that password is, etc. We're throwing little obstacles in their way to stop them from cheating, by the way. And the most important thing is that I want 2 quizzes held at random times in that 3-hour Zoom lecture each week, except for week 1 and the intersession break. So that will be a total of 24 quizzes, right? But again, to have some leeway because students get sick and they'll miss the lecture for genuine reasons, okay, fine. Only your best 20 accounts. And they're worth 1% each. So that's worth 20% of their overall assessment, right? And I have that flexibility now built in. When I say, by the way, that I'm putting a password protection and other things I'll talk about in a minute to stop the cheating, I, by the way, take the attitude that the vast majority of our students don't actually intend to cheat. It was actually worse during COVID lockdowns, because with everything that they were dealing with, some of them got desperate and they were using online calculators. And I was dealing with we were dealing with a lot of it. Academic misconducts, especially in engineering maths subjects, and there is still some of that going on. But I work on the assumption that they're not going to cheat, the majority of them, right? And if they are, even if they're using, say, AI, for example, if they learn something from it, great. And it's only worth 20% of their overall assessment, and they're really not capable of doing well in the other 80% is actually supervised assessment, well, they're going to get found out. We have, for example, a 40% threshold mark for our final exams in almost all of our maths subjects as well. Okay, and by the way, in my experience, once they're forced to stay there, if you run the first quiz, say, half an hour into the lecture, and they're there and they're hopefully engaged, then they'll actually hang around. I feel like they might as well stay. And then we have an opportunity to engage them. We get a lot of the powers that be, for whatever a good way of putting it, telling us that, well, if your failure rates are so high, you're not doing your job. Why aren't you engaging your students more? And the response is, well, wait a minute, if only 10 to 15% of them are showing up to class, how can we engage them, right? So this is one way to actually make them show up for those Zoom lectures that we can, right? And it's very important because they'll then get to see sort of their first introduction to these topics the correct way to do things explained in the lecture, which is unlike what's currently happening where most of them are not there at all. Another advantage is that with 2 classes staying at 20% each, the final exam is now only worth 40%. So the assessment is 20% lecture quizzes, 2 20% class tests, and a 40% final exam, which the powers that be have been trying to push on us for ages because it's less stress and less pressure for the students. And that's obviously a positive as well. I mean, we still have that threshold mark that I mentioned before, but you know, an industrious student who's worked hard through the subject, right, can be sitting at 40 out of 60, right, and know that they only need the threshold mark for the final exam to pass the subject. Okay. Quizzes are written online using numbers, which allows use of variables, so it'll be a unique version for each student. I'm in the process, probably over the next month, of writing these quizzes, and I think most of you know about numbers. Stephen, my colleague, and I gave a presentation about a course we did. It was actually a collaboration with UNSW, where we wrote essentially the entire course in numbers as a teaching and learning tool, as well as assessments built in. And that's great because they're automatically marked. Students can get their mark almost instantly. And if you want to, you can write solutions easily enough in numbers so they get feedback as well. So it's a learning tool as well as an assessment tool, more so than the previous in-class quizzes. Any online assessment carries the risk of academic misconduct, but being only 5 minutes long, as I said, it's harder for students to cheat in those quizzes. They don't have the time, and you can write questions that are a little bit more open-ended without making them too difficult. So it makes it harder for them to use AI to cheat with them as well. And again, my assumption is no, they're not intending to cheat. So I'm writing these, still a work in progress, in such a way that they're largely cheat-proof, that students actually have to think just a little bit about their answers, because they're not too hard. Now that's the first part of the solution, which is all great, but there's a problem. I've just solved the Zoom lecture attendance problem and transferred the problem to tutorials. Now there's no assessment apart from those 2 classes. And the tutorials, what's that going to do? The tutorials are really important. They now run as whiteboard tutorials, which means that students work together in groups at a whiteboard with a tutor kind of acting as a moderator, working around the groups and making sure that they understand not just the answers to the questions, but how to get there, proper setting out, all those sorts of things. You learn maths, we all agree, by practice, by doing it yourself. And if suddenly the numbers were way down in the tutorials and they lose that opportunity, that would be a disaster. These tutorials are very important, and compulsory tutorial attendance was thus absolutely mandatory for the subject to be run in this format, and this has also now been approved. Right, so now I have lecture attendance likely much more because they've got these assessments at random times, and compulsory tutorial attendance, so they have to attend. I think it's up to at least 80% of tutorials, or they will fail the subject. Okay, I actually did want compulsory attendance for lectures too, but I thought don't push it, not too many changes in one go. So I judged tutorials are more important, and the quizzes may solve the lecture issue. This has not been implemented yet. The first incarnation is going to be first semester this year. There is a third part that I wanted, right? Because we've the tutorials were too short with those quizzes. We really only had about 40 minutes of tutorial time. Now, with no quizzes and tutorials, there's actually more tutorial time for students to work on problems. About 10 minutes more if you factor in handout collection time, as well as the actual quiz time. But that's still not enough, in my opinion. Other subjects have now moved on to 2-hour workshops, and it has the lowest failure rate, right? So I would like all whiteboard tutorials for this subject to be 2 hours long, not just 1 hour, right? In the end, we didn't go for trying to get that approved through SAC this year because it was too many changes in one go. It's kind of the next stage, right? But as I said, I know that 2-hour whiteboard tutorials have reduced failure rates in the engineering maths subjects, and the cost of attendance in maths and computing, which Stephen has been coordinating, has actually done the same long term. So while this has not yet been approved at SAC level, at the moment we still have the 1-hour tutorials. This is kind of the next step. It's still a work, the whole thing is still a work in progress, right? Now there's one other interesting development, which is I thought as the one who's actually come up with this idea, run it by our Dean and Deputy Dean, who thought it was a good idea, got it approved through all of the SAC committees, etc., that I would be the one policing it. Because after all, I've coordinated this subject for the last 3 years, right? And then you may or may not know some of the issues we've been having at Western. We end up with a few people taking voluntary redundancies. So we have some new staff. And one of the things they decided they wanted to do was actually have people coordinating subjects that they've coordinated before, right? Literally nobody left. Right, who had coordinated Maths for Engineers 1 before. So I ended up doing that. And that's about a 200 student subject. And they thought, no, you can't do this as well. Right? So now there's a different subject coordinator for this subject, right? And I ran all of this by James, James East will be the subject coordinator to make sure he's okay, because he will be dealing with a lot of students trying to find excuses why they can't attend the lecture and providing documentation and whatever, and have to deal with special cases and exceptional cases. But he said it's fine with that. So I do intend to give a follow-up talk once we see the results of this. Obviously, it will only be one incarnation this year. Maybe I wait to see for a couple of years after next year's offering whether it's making a difference and succeeding not just in improving the student attendance at the Zoom lectures and their engagement, but also lowering that failure rate. So that's the aim, and in possibly a year and a half's time or so, I might be presenting a follow-up